Hello, and welcome back to my cabin. My name is Rory, and I'm with the Varietal. I'm a writer on the Varietal. As always, we'll do our little sound check. Good evening, GS. What we're going to do here tonight is we are going to read traditional old folktales. And tonight we're going to read a couple about Loki. That Loki. Obviously, made most famous recently by recently, I mean the last 50 years or whatever else, by Marvel. But, pardon me, but we'll see how much the Marvel portrayal holds up to the original tales. So again, if you've never seen this before, we basically do two types of tales. We'll do traditional fairy tales, and then we will do so traditional fairy tales would be like Beauty and the Beast and Snow Queen and things like that. There we are. My AC was causing the background noise there. I did turn it off. The those are kind of the fairy tales, and then the folk tales are old mythology. And something actually I'm excited about that I just discovered today, or I might have done it, is a book of Irish fairy tales put together by Yeats, the Irish poet. It seems to have a very interesting selection of classic Irish fairy tales. But tonight is about the Norse. And specifically, we're talking about Loki. Now, if you haven't watched any of our previous Loki or Thor or Odin stuff, just a little catch-up. There is a tree of life that makes up basically the entire cosmology of Norse mythology. It's called Yggdrasil. It basically means deathly gallows or something like that, which is interesting. The Yggdrasil tree has branches, and in each branch there are different realms that can be traveled to by certain things. Earth is Midgard, which will come up in this story. That just means lowly old humans live there. Asgard is where the Aesir and the Aesir live, the men and the women of a different race of people. Well, not people, gods and goddesses. And then Jotunheim is where the giants live. And we're going to touch on all three of those. It's always tough to know where to start with these myths because they are interconnected. I will say that. So, just a brief bit of background. There was a giant named Thiassi who built a wall around Asgard. And then in payment, he asked for the sun and the moon. And the Aesir would not give him that. And he saw himself as cheated. That is a story that comes up in this book, but I have to pick somewhere to start. As another note, if you don't know, Loki is part giant. I believe it is his mother who's a storm giant. So, coming into this story, those are the two things you really do need to know. And this bird here carrying a young lady will also factor in. So the first story we're going to read is called Iduna and Her Apples. How Loki Put the Gods in Danger. In Asgard there was a garden, and in that garden there grew a tree, and on that tree there grew shining apples. Thou knowest, O well, loved one, that every day that passes makes us older and brings us to that day when we will be bent and feeble, gray-headed and weak-eyed. But those shining apples that grew in Asgard, they who ate of them every day grew never a day older, for the eating the apples kept old age away. Iduna, the goddess, tended the tree on which the shining apples grew. None would grow on the tree unless she was there to tend it. No one but Iduna might pluck the shining apples. Each morning she plucked them and left them in her basket, and every day the gods and goddesses came to her garden that they might eat the shining apples and so stay forever young. Iduna never went from her garden. All day and every day she stayed in the garden or in her golden house beside it, and all day and every day she listened to Bragi, her husband, tell a story that never had an end. But time came when Iduna and her apples were lost to Asgard, and the gods and goddesses felt old age approach them. How all that happened shall be told to thee, O well-beloved. Odin, the father of the gods, often went into the land of men to watch over their doings. Once he took Loki with him, Loki, the doer of good and the doer of evil. For a long time they went traveling through the world of men. At last they came to near Jotunheim, the realm of the giants. It was a bleak and empty region. There were no growing things there, not even trees with berries. There were no birds, there were no animals. As Odin, the father of the gods, and Loki, the doer of good and the doer of evil, went through this region, hunger came upon them. But in all the land around they saw nothing that they could eat. Loki, running here and running there, came at last upon a herd of wild cattle. Creeping up on them, he caught hold of a young bull and killed him. Then he cut up the flesh into strips of meat. He lit a fire and put the meat on spits to roast. While the meat was being cooked, Odin, the father of the gods, a little way off, sat thinking on the things he'd seen in the world of men. Loki made himself busy putting more and more logs on the fire. At last he called to Odin, and the father of the gods came and sat down near the fire to eat their meal. But when the meat was taken off the cooking spits, and when Odin went to cut it, he found that it was still raw. He smiled at Loki for thinking the meat was cooked, and Loki, troubled that he had made a mistake, put the meat back and put more logs upon the fire. Again, Loki took the meat off the cooking spits and called Odin to the meal. Odin, when he took the meat that Loki brought him, found that it was as raw as if it had never been put upon the fire. "Is this a trick of yours, Loki?" he said. Loki was so angry at the meat being uncooked that Odin saw he was playing no tricks. In his hunger, he raged at the meat, and he raged at the fire. Again, he put the meat on the cooking spits and put more logs on the fire. Every hour, he would take up the meat, sure that it was now cooked, and every time he took it off, Odin would find that the meat was as raw as the first time they took it off the fire. Now, Odin knew that the meat must be under some enchantment by the giants. He stood up and went on his way, hungry but strong. Loki, however, would not leave the meat that he had put back on the fire. He would make it be cooked, he declared, and he would not leave that place hungry. The dawn came, and he took up the meat again. As he was lifting it off the fire, he heard a whir of wings above his head. Looking up, he saw a mighty eagle, the largest eagle that ever appeared in the sky. The eagle circled round and came above Loki's head. "Canst thou cook thy food?" the eagle screamed at him. "I cannot cook it," said Loki. "I will cook it for you, if thou wilt give me a share," screamed the eagle. "Come then, cook it for me," said Loki. The eagle circled round until he was above the fire, then flapping his great wings over it, he made the fire blaze and blaze. A heat that Loki had never felt before came from the burning logs. In a minute, he drew the meat from the spits and found it was well cooked. My share, give me my share, the eagle screamed at him. He flew down, seizing on a large piece of meat, instantly devouring it. He seized on another piece of meat. Piece after piece, he devoured until it looked as if Loki would be left with no meat for his meal. As the eagle seized upon the last piece, Loki became angry indeed. Taking up the spit on which the meat had been cooked, he struck at the eagle. There was a clang as if he had struck some metal. The wood of the spit did not come away. It stuck to the breast of the eagle. But Loki did not let go his hold on the spit. Suddenly, the eagle rose up in the air. Loki, who held the spit that was fastened to the eagle's breath, was drawn up with him. Before he knew what had happened, Loki was miles and miles up in the air, and the eagle was flying with him toward Jotunheim, the realm of the giants. And the eagle was screaming out, "Loki, friend Loki, I have thee at last! It was thou who didst cheat my brother of his reward for building the wall round Asgard. But Loki, I have thee at last. Know that Thiassi the giant has captured thee, O Loki, most cunning of the dwellers in Asgard." Thus the eagle screamed as he went flying with Loki toward Jotunheim, the realm of the giants. They passed over the river that divides Jotunheim from Midgard, the world of men. And now Loki saw a terrible place beneath him, a land of ice and rock. Great mountains were there. They were lighted by neither sun nor moon, but by columns of fire, thrown up now and again through cracks in the earth or out of the peaks of the mountains. Over a great iceberg the eagle hovered. Suddenly he shook the spit from his breast, and Loki fell down on the ice. The eagle screamed out to him, "Thou art in my power at last, O thou most cunning of all the dwellers in Asgard." The eagle left Loki there and flew within a crack in the mountain. Miserable indeed was Loki upon that iceberg. The cold was deadly. He could not die there, for he was one of the dwellers in Asgard, and death might not come to him that way. He might not die, but he felt bound to that iceberg with chains of cold. After a day, his captor came to him, not as an eagle this time, but in his own form, Thiassi the giant. "Wouldst thou leave thine iceberg, Loki," he said, "and return thy pleasant place in Asgard? Thou dost delight in Asgard, although only by one half dost thou belong to the gods. Thy father Loki was the wind giant." "Oh, that I might leave this iceberg," Loki said, with tears freezing on his face. "Thou mayest leave when thou showest thyself ready to pay thy ransom to me," said Thiassi. "Thou wilt have to get me the shining apples that Iduna keeps in her basket." "I cannot get Iduna's apples for thee, Thiassi," said Loki. "Then stay upon the iceberg," said Thiassi the giant. He went away and left Loki there with terrible winds buffeting him as with blows of a hammer. When Thiassi came again and spoke to him about his ransom, Loki said, "There is no way of getting the shining apples from Iduna." "There must be some way, O cunning Loki," said the giant. "Iduna, although she guards well the shining apples, is simple-minded," said Loki. "It may be that I shall be able to get her to go outside the wall of Asgard. If she goes, she will bring her shining apples with her, for she never
lets them go out of her hand except when she gives them to the gods and goddesses to eat?
Make it so that she will go beyond the wall of Asgard, said the giant. If she goes outside the wall, I shall get the apples from her. I swear by the world tree thou wilt lure Iduna beyond the wall of Asgard. Swear it, Loki, and I shall let thee go.
I swear it by Yggdrasil, the world tree, that I will lure Iduna beyond the wall of Asgard, if thou wilt take me off this iceberg, said Loki.
Then Thiassi changed himself into a mighty eagle, and taking Loki in his talons, he flew with him over the stream that divides Jotunheim, the realm of giants, from Midgard, the world of men. Stream is an understatement. It's a metaphorical ocean that only certain things can traverse. He left Loki on the ground of Midgard, and Loki then went on his way to Asgard. Now Odin had already returned, and he told the dwellers in Asgard of Loki's attempt to cook the enchanted meat. All laughed to think that Loki had been left hungry for all his cunning. Before you feel bad for Loki, let's hear both the stories, get a sense of who he is. Then when he came into Asgard looking so famished, they thought it was because Loki had nothing to eat. They laughed at him more and more, but they brought him into the feast hall, and they gave him the best of food and wine out of Odin's cup. When the feast was over, the dwellers in Asgard went to Iduna's garden, as was their wont. There sat Iduna, in the golden house that opened on her garden. Had she been in the world of men, everyone who saw her would have remembered her own innocence, seeing one who is so fair and good. She had eyes blue as the blue sky, and she smiled as if she were remembering lovely things she had seen or heard. The basket of shining apples was beside her. To each god and goddess Iduna gave a shining apple. Each one ate the apple given, rejoicing to think that they would never become a day older. Then Odin, the father of the gods, said the runes that were always said in praise of Iduna, and the dwellers in Asgard went out of Iduna's garden, each one going to his or her own shining house. Oop. Pardon me. There we go. All went except Loki, the doer of good and the doer of evil. Loki sat in the garden, watching fair and simple Iduna. After a while she spoke to him and said, "Why dost thou still stay here, wise Loki?" "To look well on thine apples," Loki said. "I'm wondering if the apples I saw yesterday are really as shining as the apples that are in thy basket." There are no apples in the world as shining as mine," said Iduna. "The apples I saw were more shining," said Loki. "Aye, and they smelled better, Iduna." Iduna was troubled at what Loki, whom she deemed so wise, told her. Her eyes filled with tears that there might be some more shining apples in the world than hers. "Oh, Loki," she said, "it cannot be. No apples are more shining, and none smell so sweet as the apples I pluck off the tree in my garden." "Go, then, and see," said Loki. "Just outside Asgard is the tree that has thou apples I saw. Thou Iduna, dost thou never leave thy garden, and so thou dost not know what grows in the world? Go outside of Asgard and see." "I will go, Loki," said Iduna, fair and simple. Iduna went outside the wall of Asgard. She went to the place Loki had told her that the apples grew in. But as she looked this way and that way, Iduna heard a whir of wings above her. Looking up, she saw a mighty eagle, the largest eagle that had ever appeared in the sky. She drew back towards the gate of Asgard. Then the great eagle swooped down. Iduna felt herself lifted up, and then she was being carried away from Asgard, away over Midgard where the men lived, away toward the rock and snows of Jotunheim. Across the river that flows between the world of men and the realm of giants, Iduna was born. Then the eagle flew into a cleft in a mountain, and Iduna was left in a cavernous hall lighted up by columns of fire that burst up from the earth. The eagle loosened his grip on Iduna, and she sank down on the ground of the cavern. The wings and the feathers fell from him, and she saw her captor as a terrible giant.
"Oh, why have you carried me off from Asgard and brought me to this place?"
Iduna cried.
"That I might eat your shining apples, Iduna," said Thiassi the giant.
"That will never be, for I will not give them to you,"
said Iduna.
"Give me the apples to eat, and I shall carry you back to Asgard."
No, that cannot be. I have been trusted with the shining apples that I may give them to the gods only.
"Then I shall take the apples from you,"
said Thiassi the giant. He took the basket out of her hands and opened it, but when he touched the apples, they shriveled under his hands. He left them in the basket, and he set the basket down, for he knew now that the apples would be no good to him unless Iduna gave them to him with her own hands.
"You must stay here with me until you give me the shining apples,"
he said to her. Then was poor Iduna frightened. She was frightened of the strange cave, and frightened of the fire that kept bursting up out of the earth, and she was frightened of the terrible giant. But above all, she was frightened to think of the evil that would fall upon the dwellers in Asgard if she were not there to give them shining apples to eat. The giant came to her again, but still Iduna would not give him the shining apples. And there in the cave she stayed, the giant troubling her every day. And she grew more and more fearful as she saw in her dreams the dwellers in Asgard go to her garden, go there and not being given the shining apples, feel and see a change coming over themselves and over each other. It was as Iduna saw it in her dreams. Every day the dwellers in Asgard went to her garden, Odin, Thor, Hoder, and Balder, Tyr and Heimdall, Vidar and Vali, and with Frigga, Freya, Nanna, and Sif. There was no one to pluck the apples of their tree, and a change began to come over the gods and goddesses. They no longer walked lightly. Their shoulders became bent. Their eyes no longer were as bright as dewdrops, and when they looked upon one another they saw the change. Age was coming upon the dwellers in Asgard. They knew that the time would come when Frigga would be gray and old, when Sif's golden hair would fade, when Odin would no longer have his clear wisdom, and when Thor would not have strength enough to raise and fling his thunderbolts. And the dwellers in Asgard were saddened by this knowledge, and it seemed to them that all brightness had gone from their shining city. Where was Iduna, whose apples would give them back youth and strength and beauty to the dwellers in Asgard? The gods had searched for her through the world of men. No trace of her did they find, but now Odin, searching through his wisdom, saw a means to get knowledge of where Iduna was hidden. He summoned his two ravens, Hugin and Munin. His two ravens that flew through the earth and through the realm of the giants, and that knew all things that were past and all things that were to come. He summoned Hugin and Munin, and they came, and one sat on his right shoulder and one sat on his left shoulder, and they told him deep secrets. They told him of Thiassi, and of his desire for the shining apples that the dwellers in Asgard ate, and of Loki's deception of Iduna, the fair and simple. What Odin learnt from his ravens was told in the council of the gods. Then Thor the Strong went to Loki and laid hands upon him. When Loki found himself in the grip of the strong god, he said,
"What wouldst thou do with me, O Thor?" "I would hurl thee into a chasm in the ground. I'd strike thee with my thunder," said the strong god. "It was thou who didst bring it about that Iduna went from Asgard."
"Oh, Thor, do not crush me with thy thunder. Let me stay in Asgard. I will strive to win Iduna back," said Loki.
"The judgment of the gods," said Thor, "is that thou, the cunning one, shall go to Jotunheim and by thy craft win Iduna back from the giants. Go, or else I shall hurl thee into a chasm and crush thee with my thunder."
"I will go," said Loki. From Frigga, the wife of Odin, Loki borrowed the dress of falcon feathers that she owned. He clad himself in it and flew to Jotunheim in the form of a falcon. He searched through Jotunheim until he found Thiassi's daughter, Skadi. He flew before Skadi, and he let the giant maid catch him and hold him as a pet. One day the giant maid carried him into the cave where Iduna, the fair and simple, was held. When Loki saw Iduna was there, he knew that that part of his quest was ended. Now he had to get Iduna out of Jotunheim and away to Asgard. He stayed no more with the giant maid, but flew up into the high rocks of the cave. Skadi wept for the flight of her pet, but she ceased to search and to call and went away from the cave. Then Loki, the doer of good and the doer of evil, flew to where Iduna was sitting and spoke to her. Iduna, when she knew that one of the dwellers in Asgard was near, wept with joy. Loki told her what she was to do. It's weird she doesn't ask, like, "Hey Loki, did you know there was a giant eagle? I didn't see any apples." By the power of a spell that was given him, he was able to change her into the form of a sparrow. But before she did this, she took the shining apples out of her basket and flung them into places where the giant would never find them. Skadi, coming back to the cave, saw the falcon fly out with the sparrow beside him. She cried out to her father, and the giant knew that the falcon was Loki, and the sparrow was Iduna. He changed himself into the form of a mighty eagle. By this time, sparrow and falcon were out of sight, but Thiassi, knowing that he could make better flight than they, flew towards Asgard. Soon he saw them. They flew with all the power they had, but the great wings of the eagle brought him nearer and nearer to them. The dwellers in Asgard, standing on the wall, saw the falcon and the sparrow with the great eagle pursuing them. They knew who they were, Loki and Iduna with Thiassi in pursuit. As they watched the eagle winging nearer and nearer, the dwellers in Asgard were fearful that the falcon and the sparrow would be caught upon, and that Iduna would be taken again by Thiassi. So they lit great fires upon the wall, knowing that Loki would find a way through the fires, for Loki is clever, bringing Iduna with him, but that Thiassi would not find a way, because giants are not clever. The falcon and the sparrow flew toward the fires. Loki went between the flames and brought Iduna with him. And Thiassi, coming up to the fires and finding no way through, beat his wings against the flames. Well, we know what happens when he does that. He fell down from the wall, and death came to him afterwards. And the death that came to him afterwards was laid to Loki. In other words, credited to Loki. Thus Iduna was brought back to Asgard. Once again she sat in the golden house that opened to her garden. Once again she plucked the shining apples off the tree she tended, and once again she gave them to the dwellers in Asgard. And the dwellers in Asgard walked lightly again, and brightness came into their eyes and into their cheeks. Age no more approached them. Youth came back. Light and joy were again in Asgard. GS says, "Oh, watch out for that eagle. High maintenance tree. well, it's got to be picked every day. To be fair, Iduna has literally no other job. So if my only job was to pick some apples every day, let's just say I would count myself lucky. GS says, I wonder why giants aren't clever. You know, I guess maybe they weren't. Maybe there were people that were giant compared to them that got exaggerated through tail. And there was just that kind of clumsiness that comes with being large. Might have made them seem a little slow-witted. Alright. So the next story basically picks up from this point. Just to put a little context on it too, a lot of what's happening here with this interpretation of it, these are all old poems, as I've mentioned before, epic kind of tales written in rhyme and rhythm, and they're very, very long. So basically, this would have been one part of a tale. GS says, but we know they're clever. Is that a commentary about me being tall? Or is that more to do with the fact that, like, they tricked Loki? I don't know how consistent their worldview is, because, like, Loki's supposed to be a trickster, but he falls for a lot of stuff. I guess Loki isn't really supposed to be a trickster. Loki is Mischief, which we're going to see more purely in this story, which is our last story we'll read today. And that is Sif's Golden Hair, How Loki Wrought Mischief in Asgard. And this is a rendition of Loki over Sif. Loki not looking as handsome as Marvel Loki. Okay, so Sif's Golden Hair, How Loki Wrought Mischief in Asgard. All who dwelt in Asgard, the Aesir and the Asinier, which is the men and the woman, who were the gods and goddesses, and the Vanir, which we'll learn about in a minute, who were friends with the gods and the goddesses, were wroth with Loki, which means they're mad. It was no wonder they were wroth with him, for he had let the giant Thiassi carry off Iduna and her golden apples. Still it must be told that the show they made of their wrath made Loki ready to do more mischief in Asgard. One day he saw a chance to do mischief that made his heart rejoice. Sif, the wife of Thor, was lying asleep outside her house. Her beautiful golden hair flowed all around her. Loki knew how much Thor loved that shining hair, and how greatly Sif prized it because of Thor's love. Here was his chance to do a great mischief. Smiling, he took out his shears and he cut off the shining hair, every strand, every tress. She did not waken while her treasure was being taken from her, but Loki left Sif's head cropped in bare. Thor was away from Asgard. Coming back to the city of the gods, he went into his house. Sif, his wife, was not there to welcome him. He called to Sif, but no glad answer came from her. To the palaces of all the gods and goddesses Thor went, but in none of them did he find Sif, his golden-haired wife. When he was coming back to his house, he heard his name whispered. He stopped, and then a figure stole out from behind a stone. A veil covered her head, and Thor scarce knew that this was Sif, his wife. As he went to her, she sobbed and sobbed. "Oh, Thor, my husband," she said, "do not look upon me. I am ashamed that you should see me. I shall go from Asgard and from the company of the gods and goddesses. And I shall go down to Svartheim and live among the dwarves.
I cannot bear that any of the dwellers in Asgard should look upon me now.
"Oh, Sif!" cried Thor. "What has happened to change you?"
I have lost the hair of my head," said Sif. "I've lost the beautiful golden hair that you, Thor, loved. You will not love me anymore, so I must go away down to Svartheim, to the company of the dwarfs. They are as ugly as I am now."
Then she took the veil off her head, and Thor saw all her beautiful hair was gone. She stood before him shamed and sorrowful, and he grew into a mighty rage.
"Who was it that did this to you, Sith?"
He said,
"I am Thor, the strongest of all the dwellers in Asgard, and I shall see to it that all the powers the gods possess will be used to get your fairness back. Come with me, Sif."
And taking his wife's hand in his, Thor went off to the council house where the gods and goddesses were. GS says, "Don't name your kid Loki." I'm sure people already are. Sif covered her head with her veil, for she would not have the gods and goddesses look upon her shorn head. But from the anger in Thor's eyes, all saw that the wrong done to Sif was great indeed. Then Thor told of the cutting of her beautiful hair, and a whisper went around the council house.
It was Loki did this. No one else in Asgard would have done a deed so shameful.
One said to the other.
Loki it was who did this, said Thor.
He has hidden himself, but I shall find him, and I will slay him.
Nay, not so, Thor, said Odin, the father of the gods.
Nay, no dweller in Asgard may slay another. I shall summon Loki to come before us here. It is for you to make him, and remember that Loki is cunning and able to do many things. Bring back to Sif the beauty of her golden hair.
That's a very strange way to phrase it. But he basically means Thor has to make Loki get Sif's hair back. Then the call of Odin, and the call that all in Asgard have to hearken to, went through the city of the gods. Loki heard it, and he had to come from his hiding place and enter the house where the gods held their council. Like I said, sometimes clever, sometimes not. And when he looked on Thor and saw the rage that was in his eyes, and when he looked on Odin and saw the sternness in the face of the All-Father, he knew that he would have to make amends for the shameful wrong he had done to Sif. Said Odin,
"There is a thing that you, Loki, have to do. Restore to Sif the beauty of her hair."
Loki looked at Odin. Loki looked at Thor. And he saw that what was said would have to be done. His quick mind searched to find a way of restoring to Sif the beauty of her golden hair.
I shall do as you command, Odin, All-Father, he said.
But before we tell you, keeping in mind that this was written by somebody later, the voice is changing here a bit. But before we tell you of what Loki did to restore the beauty of Sif's golden hair, we must tell you of the other beings besides the gods and goddesses who were in the world at the time. And I think if you're a Tolkien fan, this particular passage will be interesting to you. First, there was the Vanir. When the gods were called the Aesir, who were called the Aesir came to the mountain on which they built Asgard, they found other beings there. These were not wicked and ugly like the giants, they were beautiful and friendly. The Vanir they were named. Although they were beautiful and friendly, the Vanir had no thought of making the world more beautiful or more happy. In other words, they were self-centered. In that way, they differed from the Aesir, who had such a thought to give out to the world. The Aesir made peace with them, and they lived together in friendship, and the Vanir came to do things that helped the Aesir to make the world more beautiful and more happy. Freyja, whom the giant wanted to take away with the sun and the moon as a reward, for the building of the wall around Asgard was of the Vanir. That was a story we have not read. The other beings of the Vanir were Frey, who was the brother of Freya, and Njord, who was their father. On the earth below there were other beings, the dainty elves, who danced and fluttered about, attending to the trees and flowers and grasses. The Vanir were permitted to rule over the elves. Then below the earth, in caves and hollows, there was another race, the dwarfs or gnomes, little twisted creatures who were both wicked and ugly, but who were the best craftsmen in the world. In the days when neither the Aesir nor the Vanir were friendly to him, Loki used to go down to Svartheim, the dwarfs dwelling below the earth. And now that he was commanded to restore to Sif the beauty of her hair, Loki thought of help he might get from the dwarfs. If you know anything about Tolkien's world, all of that should sound very familiar, and that's not accidental, because he took a great deal from Norse mythology. Except he calls them Valar. Down, down through the winding passages in the earth he went, and he came at last to where the dwarfs who were most friendly to him were working in their forges. All the dwarfs who were most friendly to him were master smiths. And when he came upon his friends, he found them working hammer and tongs, beating metals into many shapes. He watched them for a while and took note of the things they were making. One was a spear, so well balanced and made that it would hit whatever mark it was thrown at, no matter how bad the aim the thrower had. The other was a boat that could sail on any sea, but that could be folded up so that it could go into one's pocket. The spear was called Gungnir, and the boat was called Skidbladnir. Gungnir is a very famous spear. Loki made himself very agreeable to the dwarfs, praising their work and promising them things that only the dwellers in Asgard could give, things that dwarfs longed to possess. He talked to them till the little ugly folk thought that they would come to own Asgard and all that was in it. At last, Loki said to them,
"Have you got a bar of fine gold that you can hammer into threads? Into threads so fine that they will be like the hair of Sif, Thor's wife? Only the dwarfs could make such a thing so wonderful. Ah, there is the bar of gold. Hammer it into those fine threads, and the gods themselves will be jealous of your work."
Flattered by Loki's speeches, the dwarfs who were in the forge took up the bar of fine gold and flung it into the fire. Then taking it out and putting it on their anvil, they worked the bar with their tiny hammers until they beat it into threads that were as fine as the hairs of one's head. But that was not enough. They had to be as fine as the hairs on Sif's head, and these were finer than anything else. They worked on the threads over and over again until they were as fine as the hairs on Sif's head. The threads were as bright as sunlight, and when Loki took up the mass of worked gold, it flowed from his raised hand down to the ground. It was so fine that it could be put into his palm, and it was so light that a bird might not feel its weight. Then Loki praised the dwarfs more and more, and he made more and more promises to them. He charmed them all, although they were an unfriendly and suspicious folk. And before he left them, he asked them for the spear and the boat he had seen them make, the spear Gungnir and the boat Skidbladnir. The dwarfs gave him these things, though in a while after they wondered at themselves for giving it them. Though in a while after they wondered at themselves for giving them. No kidding. Back to Asgard Loki went. He walked into the council house where the dwellers in Asgard were gathered. He met the stern look in Odin's eyes and the rageful look in Thor's eyes with smiling good humor.
"Off with thy veil, O Sif,"
he said, and when poor Sif took off her veil, he put upon her shorn head the wonderful mass of gold he held in his palm. Over her shoulders the gold fell fine and soft, shining as her own hair. And the Aesir and the Aesir, the gods and goddesses, the Van and the Vanna, and when they saw Sif's head covered again with the shining web, laughed and clapped their hands in gladness. And the shining web held to Sif's head as if it indeed had roots and was growing there. And that's what passes for a happy ending in Norse mythology. Well, now we see Loki, who, again, is tagged as the doer of good and the doer of evil. I think there's this really interesting cycle to both these stories that I haven't had enough time to process, so I don't know that I have much insight. But I will say there's this interesting cycle that Loki makes trouble, then fixes it. Loki makes trouble, then fixes it. And it almost seems like he's bored. What it comes down to is the god of mischief. He's not really menacing. He's just kind of bored. So he does things that gets everyone riled up, and then he's like, "Oh, it's okay. I'll go and fix it." GS says, "Well, it is made of gold, not just any hair." Yeah, but would you feel good about that? Also, I don't know why her hair doesn't grow back. I don't think the Nords just didn't grow hair. So that must have been a question that came up. I also find this interesting though because that little section of world building in the center there is reflected in the Ring operas by Wagner, and is reflected in Tolkien's work, and because it was reflected in Tolkien's work, has become a fairly standard way of looking at elves and dwarves, even though elves and dwarves have very different iterations in other cultures, like Irish myth and so on. This one became the dominant one, partially because certain writers took that world and built upon it, and I think that's really interesting. No, they didn't keep it intact. They took it as a point of inspiration and they built upon it. GS says, yes, why no explanation? Lots of value placed on gold. Oh, that's why there's no explanation. What do you call the AE thing stuck together? What's its official grammatical name? I am uncertain. It's not a diphthong, is it? I think that's something else. It's pronounced like a. Anyways, I won't take too much of your time with my rambling. I will say that I hope you enjoyed the stories. I hope that your week is going well, and I hope that you get a good sleep as the cabin fire will flicker low. We'll take you off to your room. Thank you very much for showing up. Make sure you check out tomorrow for the next book recommendation from Avalon. And make sure you're here Thursday at 6:30 p.m. when we open up the bookshop and play a game. This time it'll be something to do with romance with Avalon. So you should show. Thank you so much for coming today, though. And take care of yourself out there. Try not to let Loki shorn your hair.